Senator John McCAIN, the ranking Republican member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, traveled to Libya on Friday. We spoke to him a little earlier this morning, and I began by asking the senator if the bombing of Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli was an attempt to take out the Libyan leader or simply send a message.
I think it was probably a bit of both, and I'm not opposed to it, Matt, but you know, we've tried these things in the past on numerous occasions, whether it be Saddam Hussein or in the case of Libya many years ago under President Reagan. And so I think we ought to understand that you always run the risk of civilian casualties when you do this, and also it doesn't replace a strategy for overall to bringing about a change in the government and certainly a chance to prevent the Gaddafi from inflicting further massacres on his people. I was in, as you mentioned, I was in Benghazi, and a ship had just come in from Misrata full of wounded young men, and it was a terrible thing to see, the conditions under which they were, and in fact they were wounded and some of them were dying. We want to prevent that from happening, and I think you do that with a long-term strategy. You have been very clear, Senator, in saying you do not want to see any U.S. ground forces in Libya, and yet if we look at recent history, doesn't it teach us or show us that in conflicts like these, it often takes ground forces to get the job done, to accomplish regime change? I think that that is the case in many areas, and you're right about the history of conflicts, but the American people would not approve it. I believe it would be counterproductive. It would be helpful to Gaddafi if we put American troops on the ground, and this terrain is ideal for the use of air power, long distances with no protections for the movement of men and materiel. So I am confident that if we stepped up the fight, and that means U.S. leadership, and the U.S. is not leading, even though we are NATO. I think the Predator being in the fight is helpful. But let's face it, our allies, who are wonderful, do not have the same assets and capabilities that we do. For example, I would put the AC-130s and the A-10s back into the fight, and I would try to have more help of target identification on the ground. So we don't want to have a stalemate. The best way for al-Qaeda to have an influence in Libya would be if there were a stalemate, and clearly it would send a signal to the rest of the Arab world about what succeeds and what doesn't. While I have you there, let me ask you about Syria. President Assad's security forces have killed reportedly over 100 opposition protesters there just within the last several days. There was more violence on the ground there this morning. Is there a tipping point there, Senator, where you would say, okay, it is now a point where NATO or U.S. forces need to be involved in Syria as well? I don't see a scenario right now or any time in the near future where the injection of U.S. or NATO military action would in any way beneficially affect the situation, I'm sorry to say. That was Senator John McCAIN a little earlier this morning. Let's get a check of the